I want to welcome everyone to this very exciting webinar. My name is Mackie Siebens. I'm the Director of Admission, and I graduated from Bard in 2012. And today we are joined by President of Bard College, Leon Botstein, and photographer and Director of Bard's photography program, Stephen Shore. So for the moment, we're going to start with an introduction from Leon, and we will take it from there. Please feel free to submit questions in the chat, and I'll be moderating those throughout the next hour-long webinar. Welcome.
So it's my pleasure to introduce our featured guest here, Stephen Shore. So I don't want to sound like I'm exaggerating, but Stephen Shore is one of the greatest photographers of his generation in the world, not only here in the United States. So he's not only chair of our photography program and a long-time member, in fact, the person who really built the photography program here at Bard, and he can talk about that in a moment because he knows the most about it. But saw photography make a transition from, the printing and the chemicals to its current technology and devices. He's an artist of incredible stature, the subject of a one-person show at the Museum of Modern Art, which puts him in the same category as Matisse and Picasso. And I don't want this to go to his head. We've known each other. We've known each other for a long time, and I'm proud to say that we own some Shore photographs, and he is just a fantastic teacher and a fantastic artist. And people, think, what is photography doing in an undergraduate curriculum? Well, it is the contemporary art form of probably greatest democratic significance. It is the art form of modernity that marries technology with a long tradition of seeing and of visualizing the world and imagining the world. Increasingly with the iPhone and with modern technology, with its distribution. You're not dependent on a Hollywood studio, you're not dependent on a symphony orchestra, you're not dependent on a choir from a cathedral or the Royal Shakespeare Company. So it's a high art form with a powerful deeply democratic component. And it integrates with our daily life and every individual. And it's a window on art, it's a window on society, it's a window on ourselves. It's a tool of psychology, it's a tool of medicine, it's a tool that we increasingly rely on in the context of our daily life. And Bard has, would say this about very few programs, but I would say it about Bard, the finest undergraduate photography program in the world. So what Caltech would be to certain fields of science, we are in the arts. And among our jewels in the arts is photography. And it's to the credit of Stephen, his loyalty to the college, his belief in it, his leadership in integrating the arts with other parts of the college curriculum, making it just not a kind of a silo of pre-professional training that you might find in an art school or a design school. It is has been an honor to be his colleague all these many years and for many years to come. And now that I see that he has used the pandemic to give him even more authority than he naturally possesses, I'll turn the microphone over to Stephen.
Thank you, Leon. Hello, everyone. And Leon, thanks for that really touching introduction. Leon and I have known each other since for a long time, since 1982. And Leon has always been very supportive of my attempts to build what I also take to be the best photography department. And I think it is Leon's own personal interest in the arts and support of the arts that relates to why I particularly like teaching at Bard, because a decision that young artists have to make as they're about to enter college is whether they go to a fine arts school or a liberal arts school. And I strongly believe in the liberal arts education, especially in photography. Photography is not about photography. Photography is about the world. And the more broadly educated someone is, the richer the content of their work. And that's a case for any liberal arts education. But what makes, for me, particularly happy to be at Bard is the strength of the arts here, that our arts faculty, not just in photography, but in every discipline, is as strong as any arts faculty at any fine arts school in the country. And so it's not a compromise coming here. It seems to me to be the ideal solution for a young artist. Let me also address something else Leon mentioned, which is the place of photography in liberal arts. I spoke about how the liberal arts benefit photography, but there's the other side of it, which is that one of the things photography does is teach people how to see with attention. And that's something that that feeds anyone's growth as a person and in any discipline. And I have graduates who have become doctors, and they write to me and say how important their photography education was, that learning to see with attention has made them better doctors.
Yeah, and I might also just add to that and encourage anyone who has questions to submit those in the chat first. But I also want to impress upon students listening and parents, as a student of photography in my first year at Bard myself, and in fact, my second semester freshman year, I was in a class with you, Stephen, and I want to just impress upon everyone listening how remarkable it is to have come into this incredibly vibrant, high caliber liberal arts program and have Anmi teach you how to use a darkroom from the ground up. I had never stepped into a darkroom before, and she taught me my first semester at Bard, and then I moved into a class with Stephen as a complete novice, knowing absolutely nothing about darkroom photography, but I lined up early to register for both classes. I knew that photography was not something my high school offered, and I was really, really curious about it. And they were just some of my most memorable classes. And so to be working with such amazing photographers when you know nothing about the field itself, and when the learning curve is so steep, and these faculty members are so patient and eager to help you through the beginnings of what could become and still is a lifelong passion, is really, really remarkable. So
Stephen, Mackie's interview was great, and maybe you can say a little bit about Anmi Lee and your colleagues in photography.
We have just great colleagues. Everyone in the program is a really accomplished artist, and this is not, I'm not interested in this for the sake of names. It's not the star system. It's because if you've been through several cycles in the evolution of your work and you've really moved the bar forward in the discipline, you have a lot to teach and a lot to pass on. And part of our jobs as teachers, especially for the students who do intend to continue using photography as an art, is to essentially be a guide and guide them to find their own voices. And having that experience, that own personal experience, is essential in that. This is not something you can pass on because you read how to do it in a book or you've theorized how to do it. It comes from experience.
there's a question here in the, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say one other thing, because I'm so glad you mentioned your own experience, Mackie. And what I thought of was a conversation I had the year before I came to Bard. I had been given a job, and I was friends with a photographer named Gary Winogrand. And Gary was to my mind one of the 2 or 3 most important photographers in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, a major figure. And he had decided to move to the Hudson Valley from Los Angeles. So I asked, would you be interested in teaching? He said, and unfortunately he passed away before this could happen, but he said, I will only teach under one condition. I will only teach a beginning class. And I said, and I don't mean to embarrass you, Gary, but I mean, you're the best. Why would you teach a beginning class? He said, that's the most important class. And that made so much sense to me. And the importance of having such a strong faculty that you come without any previous experience and are taught by Anmi Lee.
I think what Stephen is saying, and he said it himself better than I could, that the whole arts faculty, I'm in music. So when you ask someone like Joan Tower or George Nantakis, both of Grawemeyer winners, we're not the star system, but they're 2 of the most recognized composers alive here in the United States. Or our most senior faculty member, Luis Garcia Renard or James Bagwell. These are distinguished performers, and they always like to teach beginners, the way Fermi and Feynman did it in physics. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner, great physicist, great teacher, was reputed to have said that if you can't explain it to a first-year student in physics, you don't understand it.
That's great.
So we have a couple of questions that have come in from the chat, which is great. The first is, I have a question for Mr. Shore. Why do you choose Bard but not other art schools? Are there any special reasons?
Yes, it really goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that unlike other colleges, the support for the arts at Bard, coming from Leon on down through all the programs, is unmatched, and that the facilities and faculty in the arts is so strong that it seems like the best liberal arts college to teach at. I know this sounds like a paid endorsement, and I can assure you I don't get a cut if you decide to come to Bard. It's what I truly believe.
Great. And then the next question is also directed at Stephen Shore. Do you think the empty world photos from this COVID period will be culturally relevant in the future?
Yes, I mean, it's hard for me to get my mind around how pivotal this period is that we're going through, and how it'll be viewed in the future. But yes, I can also say that we are now obviously teaching remotely. And one thing all the photography faculty has found is how creative our students have become. That artists have known for generations that limitations are not the death of art, that in fact art often thrives in limitations. And I have students who were confined for 2 weeks in a bedroom and a bathroom, and are producing work that I think is more imaginative than what they were doing before the lockdown. And I think almost everyone in the photography program, all the faculty, have found the same, that the constraining circumstances have led to a blossoming of imagination.
I think that's a general point that can be made. I think what we've learned, which we'll carry with us when we return to the classroom, is the stuff we've learned by trying to negotiate this medium. Photography is particularly blessed because of the nature of the medium. To find opportunities, it's harder in music and theater and dance particularly. But it is also, it's a reflection, Stephen, on the quality of the teaching and the approach to teaching that you take, that the students are encouraged to do that.
Mhm.
I wonder if we might also just take a moment as more questions filter in to maybe, if Stephen, you're able to sort of describe some of the projects that students have worked on, and maybe some sort of examples of how students have expressed themselves through photography under your mentorship, to give students listening sort of concrete examples of where students are able to go with photography at Bard.
Um, well, there have been so many students that have passed through the program since I've been here that it's hard to define. One of the things, and so they've done almost everything you can imagine. One of the things I find interesting is this, that last summer, a gallery in New York, the Howard Greenberg Gallery, which is one of the 3 or 4 top photography galleries in the city, put on a show of recent graduates, and we selected 6 recent graduates. And what was so striking about the show was that each of the bodies of work seemed completely different, completely unique, and looked nothing like the work of any of the faculty. And I thought that was really encouraging, that we're not trying to impress our aesthetic on people, but to give them a framework and a foundation to grow from and to be themselves. And some of the work was very much in the documentary tradition. Some was actually sculptural, and kind of everything in between.
Stephen, let me ask you, I think following Mackie's question, tell, if you just anecdotally, I was intrigued by your story about a doctor, right? So I think Mackie and I would be interested in students that you remember or that you're working with who don't intend to go into the profession, if you will.
Honestly, the ones who don't tend not to communicate that much. And so I do occasionally get the letter from other fields. I mean, being aware of what you see, to use that a quality of attention, and I think generally applies to life. And I think everyone in every field uses it. And when I say attention, everyone says, yes, I pay attention. But what I think I'm saying is a kind of metacognitive attention, that being aware of myself seeing, being aware of myself listening.
Yeah, but I think what you're saying is, as you know, there's a long philosophical tradition where knowledge is perception having a visual metaphor. Seeing is a way of knowing, and what you train is seeing beyond the obvious, where you control the attention of your seeing, as opposed to being, just hither, and why certain things do attract your attention. When Mackie asked about the documentation of, or someone on the question about the current time, the way you see the current time, we might see emptiness, just all we see is contrast, right? But I know from your photographs, which sometimes have no people in them, but are just landscapes or buildings, that how you see that would be instructive to me in my understanding of the world, because I don't see it that way, and I can't quite see it that way. What I was asking more is, so one of our first conservatory graduates, which has the same parallel, decided not to become a musician, but half of our students, more than half probably, end up in other careers. And one of them, who became a physician actually, made the point that her training in music allowed her, just as you were saying, to listen. You say paying attention. In our vocabulary, it's listen, to listen to the patient, listen to the individual. not only treat the disease, but the person. Because every performance, every preparation, every piece is different. And so people think, well, why study art? You know, there's going to be huge unemployment. There's a depression. We're going to have a time that's unprecedented. You know, it's comparable to the 30s. And a parent will say to a kid, you're going to go to that college, and that college, you're going to study photography. You know, you're going to fiddle while Rome burns. You know, this kind of cliche that we live with. I'm curious your own response to that objection.
Yeah, what I thought of as you're saying this was a personal experience with my son, who wanted to be a filmmaker, and he knew he wanted to be a filmmaker from the time he was in high school, and he wound up coming to Bard and graduating as a film major at Bard. But before he chose a college, I took him on a college tour to a number of different places, and one somewhere in LA, where there's some great film schools. And I at the time was a fairly good friend of the head of Warner Brothers, who was the largest photography collector in LA and had collected a lot of my work. And so I brought my son to his office to meet him, and his advice was, go to liberal arts school. That this is that you go to a film school and you'll learn a particular craft. You go to liberal arts school and you'll grow as a person, and you'll be able to deal with what comes your way.
And right before sort of all the attendees joined us, Stephen, you were talking about how you have more time to write these days, and you're working on a project right now. And because we've sort of had a series of conversations with faculty, we did speak yesterday with Daniel Mendelsohn about his writing and writing at Bard generally, but also as it's specific to language and thinking and first year seminar. And even in the sciences, with Felicia Kiesling on Monday, we talked about the importance of writing, no matter what it is that you spend a lot of your time doing. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the writing that you do alongside, obviously, your work as a photographer.
Sure. What Mackie's referring to is, we were talking about a Japanese magazine, the leading Japanese photography magazine, is going to later this year devote an issue to my work. And it includes portfolios of covering different periods, and a biographical essay, but also they asked me to pick 10 artists and 10 works of art and that have been influences on me, and write about them. And then 10 photographers from around the world have been invited to ask questions and for me to write these answers. And I have a lot of time on my hands at the moment and a lot of time to think about it. And the timing couldn't have been more perfect, because what I now do most of the day is kind of grapple with this and put these thoughts down. And I find writing helps organize thoughts, and that feeds teaching, because as I'm writing and clarifying exactly what it is I mean and what it is I think, I see that when I get back in the classroom, it has an effect on what I communicate to students.
And I'm sure there are also some students, this is sort of somewhat unrelated to the writing question, but I'm sure there are students listening who are experienced in photography as far as their high school or maybe extracurricular programs go. And there's a mix, students who have done this before and students who haven't. And we do get a question fairly often about digital versus darkroom photography. And I wonder if you could walk those listening through the actual classes available and what the sequence looks like for someone either in a position of coming in with some knowledge and coming in with no knowledge at all.
Everyone who comes in starts with beginning photography. And for the first 2 years, our work is all darkroom work. And we do this because this harkens back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about limitations. Having the limitations of film and darkroom helps people learn to see photographically, see like a camera, and have a sense of what the print is going to look like. To look at a print and see that the contrast is too low and go back and correct it and physically do this activity, to take the piece of paper out, to look at it, to go and make an adjustment, involves more of the body and just more of the person than moving a slider in Photoshop. And it makes the understanding more concrete. Our sequence is beginning photography. The second semester is a class in photographic seeing where nothing new technical is being taught. Then the second year, everyone takes a semester with a 4x5 view camera on a tripod and a semester of analog color where they learn color printing. And then after that, the fifth semester, digital is taught. We teach view camera because having a camera on a large camera on a tripod makes every photographic decision, the exact framing, the exact placement, much more concrete. The decisions become starkly etched and become very conscious. And it is the essential learning tool. I want to add one other thing. The reason we start everyone with beginning is because in a digital age, I have students, the students who are coming in now are more knowledgeable about photography than any of the students we've ever seen here. They are completely conversant with contemporary practice in photography and know the work of major photographers. May have studied photography for 4 years in high school, but have only worked with digital cameras, have never even focused a camera in their life, have never encountered f-stops and shutter speeds. And so we start at the beginning to learn the rudiments of it. And that if you learn the rudiments, you have the foundation to grow from it, which harkens back to Leon recounting, was it Feynman? Is that correct, Leon?
Richard Feynman, yeah.
Feynman, saying that if you can't explain it to a young person, you don't understand it. Conversely, the other side of it is, if you understand it that way from the beginning, then you have the foundation to grow on. You actually understand it. It's not just intellectual knowledge, but it's understanding.
Also, the other thing is that the beginner is also the first and most important entry point to widen or change an understanding that may be a dead end. If you're really interested in biology, but you think that you're made of oil and water, that's the time to correct that. If you think that that there's an ether out there, or phlogiston, or something that people used to think existed, now is the time to tell you that show me the evidence. I have a question for Stephen, who follows Mackey's. So the thing that we worry about in music, and we worry about less in photography, in the arts, is people say, I never thought of, Mackey's a great example, but although she did go into a career that required her judgment, her aesthetic judgment, before she came to work for us. My question to you is, so someone listening who just is listening, and I'm not going to Bard because I really know what I want to do. I'm not going to Bard because I've done 4 years of photography and I have a whole portfolio. I think I'm going to be a scientist, or I think I'm going to be I don't know. Or I'm not unsure, which is one of the biggest reasons when people come. I've got a lot of options, but I have no experience. How intimidating is it for the student who never thought about it, basically thinks she or he is interested in some other avenue of it, and am I going to be intimidated to approach you or your colleague? Because all these undergraduates, every college has in its admissions portfolio varying levels of interest. So Johns Hopkins has a lot of people who want to go to medical school, even though that has nothing to do with Johns Hopkins undergraduate program, but it's famous as a medical school. So parents very honestly think, oh, my kid wants to become a doctor, go to. They don't think about Bard as pre-med because they're known for the arts. That's where Saul Bellow, Mary McCarthy, Philip Roth is buried there. This is about literature. It's about the arts. You're here, and this kind of thing. So that's where we're going to send this child. But it doesn't really work that way. So, and when you go to such a place, the thing that we worry about is that how dare I set foot into your class? If you were nobody, you just had a sign said, professor of photography, and you might be approachable the way we do an English teacher or a history teacher. But in the arts, where there is a certain kind of recognition, right? I know Joan Tower has been terrific about this kind of thing. What is it like for a student who says exactly what Mackie said? I didn't have photography in high school, and I'm always taking a picture of my cat or my parent, maybe it's going to be useful, why not? I kind of, a lucky, happy-go-lucky attitude. What?
Yes. I bet when Mackie took photography, before she took the class, she had never heard of On Me or of me. And so I think it may be not like graduate school where people are choosing the school specifically often because of the teachers that are
The
there.
student culture, by the time they get here, there's going to be a buzz. So you might get local buzz.
I might add that I did my research and knew enough to be sufficiently intimidated by the remarkable work that the two of you had produced. So
that's why I'm asking the question, because
yes,
I know that you were.
That's
right.
I appreciate that. I just want to make it clear that I had thought about it, done my research, and I knew who you were when I stepped into the class. Yeah.
Our teachers are called by their first name. If the student might feel intimidated the first day, within a short time they're not, and they'll discuss things with us. They'll argue with us. I don't feel any whiff of intimidation in the classroom.
And I think the non-majors for us are among our most enjoyable students because they don't care what we think, so they'll do whatever they want, and they come up with stuff that someone who's a little more frightened because they want to make their way in the field that we're in is going to be a little more imitative and cautious.
Yeah, all our faculty are very keen on teaching our non-major classes. We teach a beginning class for students juniors and seniors from other disciplines who didn't have a chance to start in photography. Everyone who's taught it loves the class. I'm this semester teaching an Instagram class that's open to the whole college. And I limit the number of photography students that can come into it. So of the 12 students, only 3 are photography students. And I'm amazed at the quality of the work of other people. One of my star students is a math major, and she's just completing her senior project now in math, and is doing fabulous work. That people in other fields have something serious to communicate. They have a background that gives them something to express, and we're now giving them a tool for expression that they may not have taken seriously before.
And it's great that you mentioned Instagram, actually, because we do have a question in the chat about asking if the following: can Professor Shore talk about his work on Instagram? And so I wonder if you could maybe expand on your work on Instagram and even the class a little bit too.
Yeah. I'm fascinated with Instagram as a kind of global community. And it's hard to generalize because I understand there are literally 1 billion users, and people use it for all different kinds of reasons. Some people only have Instagram accounts that are selfies. Other people sell their pottery. But there is a community of photographers who are using their phones to take pictures and posting every day on Instagram. And I find it a fabulous discipline that every day as I go through my day, I'm thinking, what do I want to post today? So it keeps me paying attention to what I'm encountering all day long. And I have friends, and some of the people I follow are not photographers. So there's an architect, there's a sailing instructor who have now become friends of mine. I've gotten to know them personally, and I met them through Instagram. And what I find interesting about their work is that I think they were not particularly visual people before. The architect was, but the sailing instructor wasn't. But now he has, as he goes through his day, he's thinking about what he's going to post and is looking at the world with different eyes. And he's found it just this great experience.
We have a couple more questions. One came in through the Q&A feature, and it's from a student who is transferring from Bard College at Simon's Rock and has taken photography courses there, and is wondering at what point in the sequence they're able to join in, especially coming in as a transfer, what that process looks like.
That for a transfer, it is entirely dependent on portfolio. As I described in our program, by the end of the second year, we will expect people to have taken a view camera class and a color class and a history of photography. And we sometimes make accommodations, but we want to see where the transfer student comes in terms of that sequence.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Do you think that the purpose of photography has changed over time, or just that society and technology have changed, or both?
I see photography as a medium that doesn't have a purpose, and that people use it for their own purposes. And some of those purposes have changed. Some of what people do with it has grown. But photography is just a tool.
I want to second Stephen, if I may jump in for a second. So people forget that, let's say in the 19th century, when photography came of age, it was a period where there were many aesthetic movements that deemed themselves as realism. So the capturing in frozen time, if you will, imagery, whether it's in painting or fresco or that impulse is human, has been human around a long time. And the relationship of photography and painting, Stephen mentioned the history of photography, and Laurie Dahlberg and the people who teach that the history of photography is fascinating, and the relation of technology and the way we do is what Stephen says, it's a medium. This, I think, and as a technology, as the Instagram case shows, has continued to change. So photography is a response to a pretty consistent human impulse, and what it can do is different because it's a different medium.
Yes, and as you were speaking, I had a couple of thoughts. I agree with this what you're saying about a human impulse, that it's something as simple as sharing an experience, that you see something that means something to you. And sometimes what you see is, what you experience is visual and is best communicated visually. The other thing I thought of was the man who was the head of the photography department at the Museum of Modern Art for 30 years was John Sharkowski. And he wrote a book called Photography Until Now, which was his history of photography. But he viewed photography and the development of the medium in terms of technological change. And in the introduction, he quoted a conversation between the painter Auguste Renoir and his son Jean, who was a great filmmaker, and maybe even eclipsed his father in his stature as an artist. And this was a story that Jean Renoir told, that late in his father's life, they were having a conversation, and Auguste said, without the invention of paint in tubes, there would have been no Impressionism. And Czarkowski then adds, he's not saying that it's as simple as paint in tubes led to Impressionism. It could have been the other way around, and the desire to, the spreading desire to paint from nature led someone to develop paint in tubes. But either way, it was a symbiotic relationship. And photography, which is so dependent technologically, we see this all the time. And every time there is a new development, a new aesthetic door opens.
I want to, if I may follow up, Stephen will know this. So the great German writer and poet, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, was visually very gifted. And when you look at his letters, he did exactly what Stephen said. Well, we would now take a photograph, writing someone he cared about. I'm in Italy, and I have this little beautiful letter. He actually, in the letter, made a picture of it. He took his pencil and he drew a picture the way we would now take our camera out, or and take a picture. Here I am looking at Florence, and he did a painting exactly that way. And so the impulse to do that has changed its technology. And the same issue of the tube that Czarkowski discusses and Stephen talked about is we have an architecture and design program, which is new. And we have 2 young architects who are doing it. And it's part of the liberal arts. And the same reason we're doing it is precisely with the success of our photography program, that a modern, relatively modern technology, that 200 years old or something like that. In architecture, people will say, I once heard a conversation between a historian and an architect, and the historian said, without the elevator, there would be no skyscrapers, because nobody's going to walk up, 80, that the elevator. But then he said the same thing that Stephen said. That's one of the things we study, the relation with technology. To have a technologically causal theory of history is to rob history of its complexity. The idea of an elevator and its utility, the idea of building up, goes also back to the Tower of Babel. People always think about it as language, but the idea was to rise up above the earth in some human way. And so how these things happen is something we learn during doing these aesthetic mediums.
And it's funny that you picked the example of the elevator, because it is a complex example. It is not as simple as elevators were invented and so people built skyscrapers. The Cooper Union building was designed before there was an elevator, but they left elevator shafts because the architect understood that the elevator would have to be invented someday.
So if I might just interrupt here, and we have a couple other questions that I want to share. One is here in the Q&A, I wonder how darkroom photography might be handled in the case of distance learning or social distancing. We were talking a little bit about that before we started this conversation with everyone. And of course, there are certain things that we simply aren't able to provide with distance learning, and including our wonderful darkroom facilities. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that question that students have who might want to be, exploring this as soon as they start at Bard.
Yeah. If we were distance learning from the beginning of the semester, we wouldn't be able to have any darkroom work. And fortunately for photography, well, let's say it would restrict our program because part of the program is darkroom based. But fortunately for photography, there's the whole digital world, which couldn't be easier in terms of distance learning. So for example, my Instagram class, it's made no difference at all in terms of the work, because we don't show prints in class. Everyone is using their phone and posting every day on Instagram. And so everyone is looking at everyone's work on Instagram.
But Stephen knows this, that the questioner should know that there is no expectation that social distancing will become a permanent feature of life. This is not the first epidemic that humanity has survived. And so it may seem very new and permanent, but it's not. I believe we'll end up shaking each other's hands and hugging one another, I hope so, at some point in the future without fear. So what Stephen is saying is that they will have to improvise in reversing what we do. We have the same problem in music. You know, you could play 6 feet apart, but at some point we're going to be closer than 6 feet.
But one of the things we're doing this semester, which has caused we've seen very little interruption in the program, is because the students had already learned how to use a 4x5 camera. I'm teaching 4x5 class, which is why this is on my mind, and had learned 4x5 processing, is we sent everyone home with a 4x5 outfit and a developing tank, and they're processing, and gave them chemistry. And they're processing the film in their bathrooms, photographing the negatives and posting the negatives on, and converting it to positives and posting those online. So in terms of the 4x5 class that I'm teaching, we've had almost no interruption in the program.
We have a question here just as we come towards the end of the webinar about do photography classes use the museum on campus, and how, if that's the case?
Yes, and it depends on the show that's up. And so we're aware of what's there and take advantage of it.
Also, the CCS, the graduate program, the Center for Curatorial Studies, which is attached to the museum, has a fantastic library.
Yes.
And they also have a fantastic collection, and there are photographers in that collection. So from the history of photography vantage point, it's a very important resource.
And I wonder if we can, oh, actually, there is another question here. I have another question after that. That's just from me personally. But does one have the ability to fully participate in the photography program without being a photography major?
Oh, absolutely. We don't care at all whether people major in it or not. As I said before, some of the most interesting students we have are majors in other fields. So it makes absolutely no difference to us.
And as one of those students who wanted to try photography out and didn't end up majoring, I took a lot of those skills and those classes even as I was thinking about what I wanted to major in. So it's definitely possible. The question that I had was for students that are interested in going into photography and the world of the arts and becoming an artist, I wonder if you could speak to how the moderation and the senior project processes help a student put together an exhibit and actually get some experience, not only expressing themselves through their work, but having to present it in a professional space, because I think that's an important point to make for students interested in becoming artists.
Yeah. Well, it's particularly true of the senior project, and each of our students mounts an exhibition, and we have a very nice exhibition space in the photography department. And I've seen students do styrofoam mock-ups of the space and do miniature inkjet prints that they've spaced around to work out the sequence. Every year we have students who build their own frames if they can't afford to buy frames. They learn a lot about this. We have a senior seminar, which is not credit bearing, but talks about issues of how to organize an exhibition, how to sequence one, how we have all of our students do a catalog for the show, and how to think of the book form as something separate from an exhibition that has its own unique qualities. that can be explored. So we use that the senior year as a way of preparing people in this way for issues that they're going to encounter outside of school.
Stephen, I have a question which I see on the chat, which before we quit, which I would have asked. It's a very good question. What do you consider to be one of the most undervalued, iconic photographs or photographers of the 20th century? In other words, what, everybody knows the name, whether it's Stieglitz or Steichen but is there a photographer that comes to mind whom the viewers might never have looked at because it's not in the some kind of canon that has developed?
That's a really interesting question. And I know that you think about this a lot in music and have explored territory that is less touched. There's been so much photography publishing. We're in a golden age now of photography book publishing that there aren't a lot that haven't been published. One who has been published a lot but has not gotten the recognition I think he deserves is an Italian photographer named Luigi Ghiri, who was active in the 70s to the mid 80s when he passed away. And people who are really familiar with photography and are photography book collectors would know his work. But the general public, for the general public, he's invisible. And I think he was a major artist.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a great question. So thank you for submitting that. We have a couple more minutes, so feel free to submit any final questions you have. I want to highlight to everyone listening how involved students are in some of the not necessarily the photography students, but the campus community in a lot of these presentations of student work. These are not sort of happening in isolated moments just with faculty. Just to go back and highlight senior project in preparation for the professional world. These are exhibits that are put on by students with the help of course, of their faculty, but as a student that attended many senior projects, who actually ended up saving up in my first job out of college to purchase a painting of a fellow studio arts major in my class and have it in my office. There are some wonderful opportunities for students to support each other in these senior project presentations. And that those are obviously most visible in the arts. So it's a lot of fun. It really contributes to campus community and campus life. And so I want to just sort of throw that out there. It's an exciting sort of the spring when students are completing their senior projects is a really exciting time on campus.
As we're running out of time, I want to ask Stephen a question. There's a question on the chat I see also. Talk a little about the relation of film and photography. In other words, do you have a special, or is there, since they're both in a way, quote, modern media?
There's no formal relationship between our programs, but we offer every few years a beginning photography class for filmmakers that's taught digitally. Film involves so many different disciplines. It's from the use of the camera to structuring the editing to, if you have a script, to the script, to the narrative qualities of it. There's so much involved that we're able to take one aspect of it, the idea of visual structure, and concentrate on that. And so it's a class that a number of filmmakers have found really productive.
I want to know, do the do the film program offer is there access to your students to the moving image, how to make a moving image, as opposed to a a photograph that doesn't move. In other words, is that do you ever get people interested in that?
Absolutely. And they don't offer a specific class directed to our students the way we do for theirs, but our students have taken classes in that program. But also there are a couple of ways video, for example, has been used, and some are as art, and some are narrative, but some are like moving still photographs. And we've had majors do this with some frequency and have had people in the faculty for a number of years. John Pilson, who's now teaching photography in the graduate program at Yale, and Tim Davis, who's a member of our program, have done videos themselves. And we have students essentially studying video with members of the photo faculty if their video interest is really non-narrative, but a still camera capturing motion. And the department has a large battery of video monitors that we can set up for a senior project display.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you know, we've had a lot of shared students in music and photography, because, as you say, the capturing of motion or the representation of motion, what kind of sound, the sort of relationship that we do encourage, I think, in the curriculum, students from one art form to study other art forms as they pursue the medium of their choice.
Yes, absolutely.
I wonder if we could just, I know it's 1 o'clock, one final question here, which talks about, we talked about writing and how students are supported in that as they pursue a visual program in the arts specifically.
Matthew, I don't know if other people are here, but you're breaking up.
Oh, better?
If you could mute, Stephen, mute yourself, maybe that'll help.
Okay.
Is that better? No?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, sorry. About students who are looking to develop skills that will help them with things like project proposals, grant writing, things that they may want to take with them in addition to seeing with attention and sort of some of the skills we've talked about that are developed in the photography program.
These are some of the things covered in the senior seminar. The senior seminar is partially directed at letting the seniors see each other's work, because so many are working independently, that the kind of organic growth that happens in a class is sometimes missing if everyone is working completely independently, and this gets them together every week to see each other's work. But the other half of it is preparation for going out in the world. And it covers things exactly as you're saying, writing an artist statement or writing an application, how to present a portfolio, either commercially or to a gallery. And as I mentioned before, how to think about the structure of a show or the structure of a book.
Great. Thank you. Well, as we come to the end of our webinar, I want to thank everyone for joining us and submitting your questions. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send them my way. I'll put my email in the chat. You can reach out to me and I can help direct your questions to faculty and staff who can answer them. I want to thank Stephen Shore for taking the time to join us today. Really wonderful to have you. And also thank you, Leon Botstein, for joining us as well.
I want to thank all of you for taking the time to tune in.
Great. All right. Well, thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you all, and stay safe. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Mackie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.